Hello, welcome to HLA Live. HLA Live is our regular broadcast on the HLA YouTube channel as well as all the other social media channels. Each week we talk to interesting people from across the HLA community.
Good evening, everyone. I am really excited to be chairing tonight's meeting.
Hi, I'm Rosie Spooner and I'm hosting HLA Live this Wednesday.
And I'm an HLA scholar and I'm also going to be your host this evening.
To share with us their ideas and their innovations and hopefully bring them to a global audience.
Quite quick, we have ideas, let's do this, let's do that. So
many of the topics come from our community, with scholars and faculty expressing an interest in many of the discussions that we're about to have.
Hello everyone and welcome to the HLA Live session on widening participation in the postgraduate realm.
Homelessness and health.
Addiction and the new normal.
HLA programs are built on 6 pillars. The leader is an innovator and entrepreneur. The leader is a communicator. The leader is a manager. The leader as a negotiator. The leader as a follower. And the leader as a philosopher. If you are interested in becoming a HLA scholar, why not get in contact? Many of the episodes in HLA Live will cover one or more of these important pillars. The HLA team consists of Pedra, Eamon, Tim, Riddy, Alistair, Adil and Trisha, and a range of other HLA scholars and faculty. Episode 40 of HLA Live is hosted by Karina Dawson and is titled Less Than Full Time.
Hello everybody and welcome to this episode of HLA Live. Our topic this evening is less than full-time training. I'm Karina Dawson, I'm an acute medicine physician and for the last 6 years I've trained on a less than full-time basis and encountered both the positives but also some of the challenges that working less than full-time can bring. We have 3 guest speakers with us this evening who also have experience at training and working less than full-time. They are Dr. Michelle Horridge. She is currently a public health registrar but has worked less than full-time in a manner of training roles. She's worked with the local deanery on delivering less than full-time workshops and has set up a web page for both less than full-time doctors and supervisors to provide accurate information alongside commonly misunderstood scenarios. Our second speaker is Dr. Phil Atkinson. He is an anaesthetic ST6 in the west of Yorkshire. He has a keen interest in return to work and has been extensively involved in the implementation of supported return to training programmes within Yorkshire and Humber. Phil works as a faculty on multiple return to work courses, including the Royal College of Anaesthetists Gas Again and Bradford's Royal Infirmary React courses. He's a former Healthcare Leadership Academy scholar and a fellow of the Institute of Leadership Management, and he's passionate about medical education. He's also the clinical education lead at the former Nightingale Hospital in Yorkshire and Humber. And our third speaker is Dr. Eleanor Drager. Eleanor currently works part-time as a sexual health and HIV consultant and part-time as a sex education trainer. She started her medical training part-time, then worked full-time during her higher specialist training before going less than full-time to juggle her training with working as a BMA rep. She was the flexible training rep for the Junior Doctors Committee of the BMA for several years before getting her first consultant job. So welcome to all of you. Over the course of this episode, I hope that we can discuss both the benefits, but also some of the challenges that less than full-time training brings, and debate how we would like to see it improve and move forward. First off though, I wondered if each of you could give us a brief summary of your less than full-time training journey.
Yeah, so I graduated in 2009 and worked full-time for 2 years and then had my first baby and then returned full-time and then was pregnant with my second baby whilst doing a core surgical placement. And it was my consultant who actually planted the seed, a surgical consultant, who asked me if I'd considered going less than full-time. And at that point I hadn't. So I spoke to my TPD who was very excited because they hadn't had a less than full-time core surgical trainee. So he kind of took me around to the office and we got it sorted out. So at that point I was less than full-time in core surgical training and I was part-time in a full-time slot. And then I had another baby and I went part-time as a slot share with, so I was a surgical trainee and she was a peds trainee and we were working on a peds surgical rota. So that was interesting. And then I kind of stepped out of training for a bit and I was a trust grade reg and I worked less than full time. So again, that was slightly different because I was out of training. And then I worked as a leadership fellow and I worked full time in that post because and it is genuinely because there was no on-call commitment. It was very flexible, no weekends, no nights, and that was much more manageable with 3 young children. And then I started public health training in August 2020, and I've just applied to go less than full-time starting in September 2021. So in, out, take it all about.
Yes, you've really experienced it from lots of different sides, I guess.
Yeah, very much so. And it's each way that you are less than full time, be it part time in a full time slot sharing with someone within specialty, outside your specialty. They all bring different challenges.
I guess I similarly have had a few different ins and outs of less than full time training. I originally worked less than full time 7 years ago after the birth of my first daughter. My wife was an EM and pre-hospital emergency medicine trainee, and we discussed it, and it made sense for, at the end of her mat leave, for her to continue her training and finish off her training full-time, and for me to work less than full-time because I was a anaesthetic core trainee at the time. So I worked less than full-time for about 2 years, looking after our first daughter Zara at about 60%. And when my wife CCT'd, we swapped back. She then took on more of a childcare role, working 3 days a week, and I was back on full-time. And our second daughter was born, Zara, and unfortunately when Zara was about 6 months old, my wife was diagnosed with a brain tumour. She had an operation and sadly spent the next 6 months as an inpatient in hospital. And so I was off across that period, and then was incredibly well supported back into the workplace. I couldn't really imagine coming back at one point, but came back with supernumerary 50% less than full-time training, but kind of to juggle childcare, looking after my wife, and somehow try and keep a career. And then over the next 3.5 years, life has kind of steadily improved, and more importantly, my wife has fought with physiotherapy and occupational therapy and speech language therapy and everything else, and has slowly got a bit better, such that I'm now up to 80% less than full-time training, and I anticipate completing my training at roughly that amount, just because as my life gets easier, I've got more time to spend at work. But for me, it's been incredible because it's given me the ability to keep my career and look after what's important, which is my family.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess is that partly where obviously you're very involved in return to work training. Is that kind of come from your experience? Obviously, you've got a lot of experience from that, and that kind of came back as well.
So that's to some extent where that stemmed from. I had 6 months off and initially came back. Like I say, I couldn't imagine initially how I could possibly juggle everything, and was brilliantly supported by both the school and the deanery. And then the dean of less than full-time training at that point said to me, will you come along, support your return to training starting in this region, will you give a talk about your experiences? And I did that, and kind of things snowballed from there.
Thank you. And Eleanor, would you like to tell us about your journey?
Yeah, so I've done a lot of different things as well. So I actually started my entire medical career in 2000 part-time. I had depression when I was at medical school, and I was actually going to leave medicine entirely after I'd qualified. And one of my medical school colleagues, her job share fell through. She had kids, and she contacted me and said, could she share my jobs with me instead of me leaving? And I was like, oh yeah, that's a great idea. I didn't even know you could be a doctor part-time. No one had mentioned that to me. Anyway, so then we shared our jobs for 18 months. And then I went full-time, and I was full-time for about, but I was told, by the way, to never tell anyone that I was depressed, and that was why I was part-time. I even wrote an article in BMJ about part-time training, and I was told just to say that I was ill at medical school. So anyway, I then worked full-time for ages. Like I went to Australia, I was an SHO, I became a registrar. And then I had my first son, my only son, my first child. And then I went part-time sort of with him. So I went 80%, but I was still doing stuff for the BMA. And then I got pregnant again. And when I came back to work after my daughter was born, I knew that I wanted to do stuff in the BMA, and I wanted to be a registrar, and I wanted to have a little bit of time to be a mum. So I applied for part-time training. But interestingly, I wasn't allowed to apply for part-time training on the basis of the BMA. I had to apply on the basis of childcare. But actually, I ended up working effectively full-time because I did 3 days a week for the NHS and 2 days a week for the BMA. And my daughter was both of my children were in full-time childcare at that time. And then I completed my registrar training part-time. And then again, I was advised then that I should get a full-time consultant job because it would be a mistake to be part-time. And so I got a full-time consultant job, which I did 4 days a week, interestingly. So I did all of my hours in 4 days and had a day off a week with my kids, which was great. And then my relationship fell apart and I suffered burnout. And I can say now that I don't think I was supported very well through that. And I had some time off, then I had a failed return to work. And then I just resigned and left the NHS. And I spent 4 years out of the NHS entirely. And in that time, I started being a sex education trainer part-time. And then eventually I missed my patients. It took longer than everyone said it would. And this year, I started again as a part-time consultant in the NHS in a different trust. And I was completely honest in my interview about all of these things. And they gave me the job anyway. And so now I work 3 days a week in the NHS, but one of them from home because pandemic means they've realised that you can do admin at home and the world doesn't end, which is fantastic. 2 days a week in the hospital, and the other 2 days I juggle my children, sex education, and a bit of medical writing. And now I consider that I've got the portfolio career that I basically always wanted. But my route to it was much more complicated than it needed to be. And I've always been a massive advocate of part-time training right from the very, very beginning. And I was always disappointed that I wasn't told it was possible to be part-time, because I think life might have been slightly easier in the beginning.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, so as I said at the beginning, I've only been a lesson plan for about 6 years. So compared to actually you guys, you know, not nowhere near as long as you guys. I guess, how do you, you know, obviously you kind of described a little bit how it's changed, but I think, you know, if you start with Yelena, because you've been through it for the longest. I mean, in terms of less than full-time training, how have you seen the landscape change kind of over since you first started?
So, I mean, there's some really obvious things that in 2000, when I was negotiating my less than full-time jobs, first of all, it wasn't called less than full-time, it's called flexible training. Secondly, I mean, I'm going to do that in my day thing, but it's totally true that my first ever job was ostensibly 3 days a week, and I was doing 39 hours a week. And I remember telling my friends who were not in the NHS that I was working 39 hours a week part-time. They were like, you know, Eleanor, that is more than full-time in most jobs. I was like, so then it was all, I have to say though, that once I was accepted to train part-time then, the then TPD in 2000 was amazing. And was like, oh, it sounds like you've had a terrible time at medical school and I'm so sorry. And of course we need to get you back into medicine and this is the very best way. And he was completely lovely. And we got 3 bespoke, lovely jobs and it was really great. And then when I applied to go part-time, 9 years later, when I applied to go part-time again, it had become much more regimented and I had to tick all the boxes and I had to fit the right category. And if I didn't fit the right category, then it was thrown out. And then there was a real, who was going to pay for my on-calls? Who was going to pay for this? And at one point I ended up working full-time when I didn't want to, because they'd said for about 6 months, because they'd said that I could be part-time, but I couldn't do any on-calls at all. So my salary was going to drop by an unfeasibly large amount of money and I couldn't afford to feed my children. So I felt that there were a lot more barriers. But once I was part-time and working with my consultants locally on the ground, it was amazing. So I worked really flexibly and they let me do all sorts of things because the BMA role wasn't very rigid. What they let me do was do things like, I basically agreed with them as a registrar that I would do, 6 sessions a week or whatever I was, but that I could do them on different days of the week, so that sometimes I would work full time in the NHS for 2 weeks or a week, and then I would do 3 days of BMA work in the same week, and then I would have a day of looking after my kids, if you see what I mean. So I would sort of had benefits both ways. One was that it meant that I could sometimes offer to do a day that no other registrar wanted to do because they had other things to do with their time, but I'd be like, oh, I can do a Friday, that's fine. And then other times I could have a day off when, one of my kids had a, Christmas show at school or some kind of important thing, because I gave the time back in a different way. But it also made my training better, because one of the things that always bothered me is taking away the word flexible means that it could become very rigid for some people. So I don't know what your experience has been like, Michelle and Phil, but some people I know were told, well, you only work on Mondays and Tuesdays, so you can never come to the Thursday teaching. And so for me, I identified, for example, I wanted to learn about HIV resistance. And so I changed my days around for 6 months so that I could be the resistance registrar. And you have to, with childcare, you have to do that in advance. You obviously can't do it on a weekly basis. I had to do it for 6 months and then do another 6 months. But I always really wanted to say to other people that that's what flexible training should be like. That you should be able to, in time, do all of the days of the week if that works with your childcare, or with whatever other reason you're part-time. That when I was part-time in the very beginning and people found out I didn't have children, they were like, but I don't understand. How can you be part-time when you don't have children? Like, what's your reason? It was very weird. Whereas no one ever asked the chair of the BMA why he was working as a part-time anaesthetist. Because he was the chair of the BMA, and so that was felt to be important enough that it didn't matter that actually he was only doing, I don't know how many sessions a week for the NHS.
I think your point about flexibility is really interesting, because that we've moved away from flexible training because I think in most specialties it's so inflexible.
Yeah.
And I think because increasingly those supernumerary posts are so rare, and a lot of it is slot sharing. So it is a case of, you know, I work Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and you work Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. And then this awful panic every 6 months when you change that, what if the other person works Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and I want to work Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and my nursery is full, and there are all these things. And I think logistically it's difficult, but it's also quite stressful. And then you kind of alluded to it earlier, Karina, about the commonly, I would say, misinformed situations. So, you know, like you said, Eleanor, you know, if there's a little finger surgery that happens on a Friday, a lot of trainees will be told, well, you work Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, so what you do in your own time is up to you. Yeah. So yeah, if you'd like to come in on the Friday and see that, that's fine, but you're still expected in work on the Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. So I think it's not my experience in all my jobs, but there's a lot of inflexibility. And also with the complexity of rotas, hours, out of hours provision, it's virtually, it's hard enough to get fixed day working that actually fixes to the days that you work. So if you then want to do something extra, it does usually fall to the trainee to kind of figure that out. So I wish training was more flexible, but what I have noticed is that now I've moved away from surgical training, there's a lot more flexibility because I'm in a more kind of 9 to 5 specialty. So even within medicine, there is huge scope for variation. And one of my surgical jobs, we did 7:30 till 5:30 as normal working days. And my consultant just told me to work 3 days a week. That's 60%. That's what we'll pay you, and that's what you'll do. So it's a lot of it is kind of these older attitudes, but I think there's a definite shift. And I think my recent experience is that, and I don't know if it's been precipitated by the consultant kind of contract and these massive tax bills that a lot of consultants have ended up having, and have gone from working kind of 14 PAs to actually, I want to work 10 PAs over 4 days or 3.5 days or whatever that might be. And so I think there's a cultural shift. I've seen it since 2012 or whatever, and there has been a change, and it's a lot more acceptable. A lot of trainees now don't want to work 60 hours a week and then do e-portfolio and then do this and then do that. People want to do other things, and I think as doctors, you know, you look at what you did pre-medical school to get into medical school, and then there's a period where, oh no, you can't join that sports team because they train twice a week and you can't go to that, or you can't join that choir, or you can't do these things. And then I think there's a bit of a realization that actually I really want to do those things, and in any other job I might be able to do those things. So
absolutely. And I would say as well that one of the reasons that my registrar role ended up so flexible is that I put a lot of work into that. Like, you know, I really did. I got to know everybody. I, you know, went in, I did like what all other trainees have done since the beginning of time, which is extra hours that I wasn't paid for, and going in to do those lists. And the reality of that, unfortunately, is that at the moment the system is not set up unless the trainee does put in a lot of time and effort to do that. But I still remember the person that I did a job share with in the very beginning. She was a very pragmatic person. We're still in touch now. She's a GP. And our surgical consultant was absolutely like, I've never had people working part-time for me before. This is the worst thing that's ever happened. I just can't believe how terrible it is. And she said to him, but who looks after your patients on a Saturday and Sunday when you're not on call? And he said, well, the other doctors. And she said, oh, okay, but how come that's okay? He said, what do you mean? She said, well, you're not in the hospital on Saturday and Sunday except for every fourth weekend. So 3 out of 4 weekends, someone else is looking after your patients. So why can't Eleanor look after my patients on a Thursday and Friday when I'm not there? And he was like, oh. And this absolutely, and for some reason, just her saying that to him made him say, well, all right, then I'll give it a go. I'll see if it works, for me. He felt like we'd been foisted on him in some kind of horrible practical joke, and how was he ever going to cope? And in fact, he ended up writing an article with us for the BMJ because he was like, you were great and it was brilliant and there was never an issue and I don't understand why it was such a problem. And it's because no one had ever done it before with him. And so he felt that it was impossible. And of course it's not impossible because people have had weekends off forever.
If you're not there, fundamentally, the system keeps on turning.
Yeah, exactly.
The system doesn't really notice your absence. We believe that we are utterly integral parts of the NHS, and we are, to some extent, brought up to believe that if we're not there, it's all going to fall apart. And it's a lie. Yeah. If you have any decent amount of time off, that becomes painfully apparent. I mean, like you say, I think you've got to be incredibly organised in general. I've been very lucky that I knew some of the right people to go to for my request in the first place. But still, I had to learn every piece of documentation there was, go through the Gold Guide, go through all of the policies and protocols of the Deanery, and systematically walk people through it. I was, I think, the second man who'd gone less than full-time training for childcare within the region, which initially raised quite a few eyebrows. And certainly when I first introduced myself on a list to a new consultant and we were working today, and the fact that I haven't seen you before, so I work less than full-time, so I might have missed you on some other days. And I generally, early on, I'd initially get this look of, he doesn't look crazy. And and he doesn't look that sick. What's wrong with him? What's wrong with him? What's wrong with him? And I'd explain it was down to childcare. And in general, that was, by the end of the day, once we've been chatting away, the vast majority of my colleagues would turn around to me, I wish I'd had that opportunity. I wish when my kids were growing up, I could have spent more time with them and balanced things better. That sounds brilliant. And there was the odd, I think it was 2 across my entire training, people who just still couldn't fathom it after a day of me chipping away at them. In general, incredibly well received. And the same with I took some unpaid paternity leave at the end of one of my wife's maternity leaves. And again, first man in that hospital to ever go through that. I asked HR and they said, oh, that's not us, that's medical staffing. Medical staffing said, no, that's not us, that's HR, and kind of got battered in between. And in the end, I got hold of the policy and I walked them through it. I told them exactly what they needed to do to make my paternity leave work. And it did. I think it does require being, like I say, incredibly organised, and you might be lucky and things might go brilliantly, but you need to be prepared for that when they don't. I was previously told at one point that I couldn't go supernumerary at 50%, at 40%. That was when I was first coming back. We thought maybe 40%. We were told that wasn't possible. That wasn't the case. As it was, I didn't need to go 40% because things were slightly better than anticipated. I came back at 50%. But it's sometimes you get those roadblocks of, no, you can't do that. And if you go, well, where's that written? Where does it say that I can't do that? You rapidly find that those are imagined barriers and that you can work through.
When you said about not being able to work 40%, I remember sitting on some big flexible training meeting as a BMA rep. And this man opposite me said, he wasn't a medic, he was a stakeholder from some other place. And he said, it's just outrageous. No one can ever train less than 50%. He said, if anyone trains less than 50%, we should say that that's not appropriate. And furthermore, if anyone trains and he started saying things like, what if someone wanted to train 10% for 6 months? That would be terrible. And I was like, why would that be terrible? Why couldn't someone train for 10% for 6 months for, if there was a really good reason for it? And anyway, then I went to a separate meeting because at that time revalidation had just come in. And the very first person to be because one of their reasons for saying that you couldn't train less than 50% was to say, well, you will never be able to revalidate if you work less than 50% because you won't do enough procedures. And then the very first doctor to revalidate was the chair of the GMC at the time, who did 1 clinic a month in his clinical job. and the rest of his time was non-clinical. And he revalidated, because in his 1 clinic a month, he was perfectly safe to look after patients for the things he looked after them for. And I was like, don't tell me that a trainee can't work 40% or 30% because they need to, and say they can't revalidate. Of course they can.
I accept that when you're, first of all, learning a new skill, so perhaps when I did my initial assessment of competence 3 months within anaesthetics, or when subsequently I was doing pure cardiac anaesthesia or neuro anaesthesia, having a kind of critical mass period of time so you can really get your head around it and hit the ground running is really useful. And stretching that period out does definitely make it harder. So for an initial assessment, your first 3 months of anaesthetics, where it's completely new, if you do that less than full time, it would take 50%, that would take 6 months. But I wonder if it might take 7, and it might take a bit of additional support because you don't quite get that same critical mass. That said, training over a longer period also offers a lot of opportunities that training full-time doesn't, in terms of spending longer at a particular base hospital, knowing the teams, additional extracurricular opportunities come up that you're able to seize. There's a lot of additional benefits. But I think in some small aspects of training, particularly when you're at a more junior level, it does make things harder.
So I agree with Phil. I'm super organised. I've got the family whiteboard. I've got the coloured pens. I have plan A, B, C, D, Z. And that's what we talk about on the less than full-time training days. If you're less than full-time for health reasons, try and get your off days on the days you have all your appointments. If you've got childcare, you kind of need backup and then backup and then backup if you can. But I think having access to all the documents, and like you say, going in with this is what I want and this is where it says I can have that, is one of the things. I think sometimes I didn't know about unpaid parental leave until about 2 years ago. That would have been incredibly useful. It's not well advertised. I use that term loosely. But I think, how do we kind of, as less than full-time trainees going in to be consultants, how do you challenge that? Because I agree, there are certain times in life where there will be people who cannot train 50%. It has to be a little bit less. And having a kind of diktat that says, no, it is that or nothing, then there is a little group of doctors who will leave, who we lose. And they are perfectly capable of doing the job, just not at this pre-prescribed level. So it may be that you're 40% less than full time and you're just maintaining competencies. So you're kind of on a paused training. And I know there's kind of discussions ongoing about paused training, step on, step off, but actually, how do we make it so that we don't lose those doctors, they don't lose their skills, but maybe we just keep them ticking over for a little bit of time to get them back on their feet for whatever reason that may be. And I don't think, as doctors, we're very kind to other doctors, and I think that's kind of a fundamental flaw, and it comes up worse in less than full-time training than anything else.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And my example of the 10% was, it was never that we as the BMA or I was saying, oh yeah, I think everyone should, work half a day a week, because your training would take forever. It would be ridiculous. But I can absolutely see that whole, you're right, basically, there's a big difference between pausing and working 1 or 2 days a week for 6 months because actually the other things in your life mean that you cannot do more than that, and leaving entirely.
Yeah.
Because leaving entirely,
or going off on long-term sick.
Yeah, exactly. And leaving I'm aware how lucky I am that I was able to leave entirely and then come back.
It's not easy.
It's not an easy thing to do, and I do feel very lucky that that's happened to me. But I also know of people who left entirely and will never come back. And I believe that those people would have stayed if there had been more flexibility in the system.
I think so. Certainly I had a period of time where I could not imagine coming back. Yeah. I couldn't work out how that could possibly have been done. And I'd worked out, right, I can do these locums to pay my mortgage. This is the least number of hours I could put in per month in the most flexible way. Fine, I'll just have to resign my training number. I'll never get to consultancy, so be it. But was absolutely brilliantly supported. I was really lucky that I knew all the right people, and they absolutely went into bat for me and just, they just walked me through it and went, right, Phil, we're going to take it a step at a time. And I think part of that was, I slightly disagree with you, Michelle, in terms of going into the thing of terms of this is what I want and this is where it says I can do it. It's more, this is what I'd really like to have. how can we maybe make that happen? And if they said you can't do that, it's like, oh, I'm surprised, because I could have sworn that when I read this document.
Sorry, yeah, that's my covert plan. My overt plan is not.
Like, shall we
I'd like to do this. Yeah. And I would say that's not been done, but actually.
Yeah, so I did that more. I planned and I prepped, and it was all ready to go, but it was much more. It was a bit softly.
Yeah, but the other thing as well, though, is that when I look back, I can see how successful a lot of my training was in terms of, you're right, the building up relationships, staying somewhere for longer, the knowing everybody. That's amazing. But I worry about, well, A, the people who will leave if they don't get this opportunity, but B, the system in general, because if we don't learn as a system how to deal with everybody's various life hiccups and disasters and wishes and everything else, especially with all the stress of COVID and the pandemic, I really worry about, a wide swathe of doctors just not being there anymore. Actually, there comes a point where you are worse off if you work more hours because of what they've done with the tax for consultants anyway. And so if you're working as a junior doctor all the hours and then everything's terrible and there's no flexibility, and then you look up at your consultant colleagues who are going part-time for financial reasons because it's better for them to go part-time, I don't know, I just feel like it's not quite the same as it was 20 years ago when it was worth it and you'd get a Mercedes.
I think that's a really good point. And I think, Michelle kind of touched on it as well, talking about, you can see, I think the culture is changing for consultants as well as trainees. And there's certainly more and more trainees coming through, and, for various different reasons. And obviously now we've got category 3 training coming in, so you don't need to have a reason at all to, be less than full time anymore and tick those boxes. I've heard people saying that, a lot of people are going to go 80%, because I think a lot of the category 3 pilots, people did go 80%. And how will our rotors cope? We can't cope with having everyone 80%. If people are 60%, they can job share, but if it's 80%, then we've got all these gaps. And in the Northeast, we've had this issue of people asking to go 80% and being told, no, you've got to stay 60 because there's not a gap for you to go into 80. Your job share, and you've got to stay in that. Do you think that's that's valid? And do you think, how are we going to get around this? Everyone wants to work 4 days a week.
My answer to that is always that 80% of someone is better than 0% of someone.
No, and my other answer to that is you just need to employ more people. It's not rocket science. Doctors have worked more hours than most other professions in the NHS if they're full time. And so it's been expected that, for example, you can staff a rota. When I did ITU, we had something like 6 or 7 doctors on a full-time rota, and the equivalent for the nurses was 8 or 9, because the nurses were under a different contract to us, and that was felt to be acceptable. I've never understood why doctors don't just go, well, can't we have 8 or 9 as well?
Maybe we get rid of the full-time rota. Maybe that's into a box, so that's a full-time person, and just have a fluid rota. Well, yeah, and also much better for everybody.
And also, you're right, 80% of a person is so much better than 0% of a person. It's not, and there's quite a lot of evidence that a 4-day week in general would be better for society than a 5-day week.
For me, I'm 36, and this is the first job where I felt like I've been treated like an adult, in that you're not number 7 on this rota and you will work these hours, and this is what will happen to you as a fully grown, very qualified adult. It's kind of the infantilization of trainees. And you're saying like you can't go from 60 to 80, but it's like, well, why can't you just fill there must be gaps elsewhere? No, I've yet to see a fully staffed hospital rota that doesn't have that like bright green line where somebody needs to fill in that gap. So it goes back to that lack of flexibility, I think.
But it's partly as well that someone else can't have my training number until I finish it.
Yes.
Even if my training subsequently takes much longer than the 7 years that it could have. So, and I think there's got to be a point whereby we can look broadly across training across a number of years and work out that, okay, we allowed X number of full-time national training numbers for this specialty in this region, but actually lots of people have been working less than full-time. And so we can do a calculation whereby we need to increase the number of training numbers by this percentage, so that we're still churning out the same number of doctors in every decade cycle. That's not being applied. Fundamentally, the allocation of national training numbers hasn't caught up with the changes in less than full-time training.
And then if you look at the consultant, it will be really interesting to then look at, of those less than full-time training, so much more popular. So if you looked at anaesthetics, for an example, 10 years ago when you recruited this many, how many then went less than full-time, and how many of those that trained less than full-time then went on to work slightly less than full-time or reduced PAs as a consultant? Because it probably matches up.
Oh, you can. So I'm nearly there. The full-time consultant contract feels a lot like a less than full-time job at the end of it.
Yes,
and in terms of how you can generate your hours, because they're always long days. You're always it's always probably 3 PA days, and you can do those it's not 5 days a week job. And they often do a lot of nights and weekends and stuff.
But then the question is, why is that so different? Because as an anaesthetic trainee, you're there very early. You stay until your last patient is recovered and awake and speak to the family or whatever. So why is there such a disparity between the two? Because I don't know about you, but a lot of my friends are now consultants. I'm way off, but that's fine. And everybody says, oh, it gets better. It gets so much better when you're consultant, because you have more say over what you do. You've got more control over your hours. The hours are better. The lifestyle is better. But for a lot of people who work less than full time, you may double that time, and that consultant job is a long way off. It is a long time to think it's going to get better. It's going to get better.
Well,
and then
I've never liked that argument.
Not necessarily better.
I've never really liked that argument of it will get better when you get there in the end. I've always preferred the whole, okay, well, what can we do to change this now for me and for the next people coming through? Because I don't want it just to be fine because I made it. I want the next group coming through to have a better life and to have better training and be better quality doctors at the end of it.
But what we need surely is to start actually treating junior doctors in inverted commas like the adults that they are. I mean, I was 25 when I qualified, and I remember sitting in some meeting when I was 37 and still a registrar, which is fine, by the way. Obviously, I had no issue with that. I was sat in a meeting with someone. It was in the BMA, to be fair. And we were trying to argue a point about something. And he said, well, I've been a consultant. And he literally had been a consultant since the year I was born. And I was 37. And he'd been a consultant for 37 years. And he was saying, and in my day, it was like this. And he had a bow tie that he was wearing. And he was saying, I just don't understand all these people coming up who, they're so young. And he pointed at me as if I was some teenager. And I was just thinking, I'm 37, I've got 2 children. I've been a doctor for 15 years. Like, what on earth? No, not that long. Anyway, 12 years. Why are you treating me like I'm a child? Because to him, I was a child. In his head, not a child, but you know what I mean? Like a really young person. And I had another thing I was going to say, though, as well, about being more in control of your hours and of other things, and the annualization of rotas, which is that I think all rotas could be done in that way. It's not just about people providing 24/7 cover. I really believe that if you actually sat down all the junior doctors in a room who were, in charge of a particular rota and said, right, there are 9 of you, there's this 6-month rota, and there needs to be at least one of you at any one point, go. I'm absolutely sure that almost any group of doctors would be able to sort that out between them if they were given 2 hours in a spreadsheet. But instead, what happens is that either someone in HR does the rota and has no understanding of what it actually means, or some hapless registrar has to do the rota for the SHOs. Am I still allowed to say SHO? Anyway, core trainee. And then you end up in a situation where the rota is not written for the people who are on the rota, or by people who work the rota, and it makes no sense.
I mean, yes, the rota's consistently a challenge. But again, you're organised. It's all planned out in the diary for the next 6 months, along with the childcare to go along with it.
But even that's been a big change.
I've got used to changing that with everyone. Am I on a different slot share? Have I got my own slot that I can actually pick? Wow, that's amazing. Or am I splitting, 3 lines across 4 people with, divvying up bits? I've always found that fundamentally, once we sat down and we worked through it, like you say, we could get through it and we could make everything work. But a lot of this, I think, comes with the responsibility that less than full-time grants to you, that you said about we're adults and we're adult learners. And yes, you need to, that's a right, but it's also a responsibility because you do, not everyone is quite that prepared to put in the time to get it sorted. And not everyone is prepared to find out the information. People at times just want to be spoon-fed. It's important to realise how far we've come in 70 years. That 70 years ago, you could be dismissed from medical school or from your jobs because you were married or because you had a child. And we now have these abilities to now work less than full time because for category 3 reasons. But I do think with those rights come responsibilities. And we have to, like you say, be adult learners. If we want to be treated like adult learners, we have to act like that. And we have to be ambassadors for those coming after us.
So you've got to be way ahead of your full-time peers in terms of your training opportunities. You've got to be as organised about your training as you are about everything else. Everything, there has to be a plan, because if you're there less, you have less time. Even though you're there longer, you just have to be really strategic and organised and honest. Because if you're there all the time, full time, then, this case happens or that case happens and you're kind of around. Whereas I think if you are there less, like you say, it is a responsibility. You've been given the chance to train less than full time and it's all going well, but the responsibility is on you to complete your less than full time training in that fashion. And I think, like you say, I think there maybe has been, or people have had a bad experience, maybe a less than full-time trainee who gets to the ARCP and things aren't quite completed. And actually, it's kind of letting the side down, because there are so many less than full-time trainees who are super organised and on it and make sure that every I is dotted, every T is crossed, their training is super organised. But it takes a special kind of motivation to work like that. And I think we kind of need to remind people of that sometimes.
Yeah, although I suppose my frustration with that is, although I was that kind of person, is that obviously there are people out there who are training less than full time for other reasons, who maybe cannot be that organised because they're unwell in some way, or they're physically unable to do those things, and so I think we need to make sure the system works. But for everyone. But what I also wanted to talk about was something that when you were talking about your training number, Phil, and how it can't be given to anyone can finish. And I remember having this realization when I got to the end of my registrar training, that I was like, it's taken me forever, and I've had 2 kids and I've trained part-time, and I'm, this. And then I looked around at all of the registrars who I'd started with and the registrars that I was finishing with. And I realised that actually there were 3 people that I'd overtaken because they'd done PhDs. And so they didn't have children at the time. They didn't have children, but they'd done PhDs. One of them spent 4 years doing PhD. Somebody else went and did a master's in America. They're all obviously like eclipsing me massively academically. But no one ever said when my colleague came back from 4 years doing a PhD, where she was doing, I think, at one point only 1 clinic a week and at another point no clinics at all. Nobody batted an eyelid when she came back. No one was worried that she was coming back to the ward. I went on maternity leave for 9 months and it was like the world had ended when I came back and I was useless and didn't know anything. Now, that's because I believe that somebody who was coming back for childcare reasons was viewed differently to someone who'd gone and done a PhD, whereas actually I had been out of clinical medicine for less time and I was arguably more up to date than they were. I mean, obviously I also had a newborn, but it's interesting how people are viewed differently depending on the reason that they are A, out of medicine, B, part-time, C, doing things slightly differently than other people. And I think that's one of the things that I would really like to challenge going forward, which is actually, if I look at all of those people I was a registrar with, we've now all got consultant jobs in some way or another, and we're all doing totally different things with our careers, and they're all valid. They're completely different, but they're all valid. And why shouldn't they be? And why is it that one is seen as more valuable intrinsically than another?
I think that's a really good point, and I think you're very right. Actually, I think the reason someone is less than full time absolutely impacts on how people view them as a less than full time trainee. Very, very wrongly so. We should welcome all these people.
We should celebrate all that diversity, because it's the other stuff that people bring.
Yeah, well, look at Dr. Ranj. he trained part-time all the way through so that he could do things like CBeebies and Strictly Come Dancing, and I mean, obviously, like so many parents have grown up watching, not grown up with their kids, watching Dr. Ranj on CBeebies, and he's this like icon. He was only able to do that because he trained part-time. He wasn't able to also be a full-time. I think he's amazing. Obviously, I mean, I'm massively envious. He's done incredibly well. But why is it that he gets celebrated and lauded and he gets to be on Strictly Come Dancing? Because him being a TV doctor was seen as somehow more valuable.
But I suspect not by all of his superiors or peers.
Yes, no, that's very true. Yes, that is.
Who probably did not see it as a valid.
Yeah. He will have had a challenging time coming through at times, won't he?
No,
yeah, really challenging. I remember a very wise APD once saying, like, anyone that's less than full time is not sat at home on their days off with their feet up reading, what did she say, the Radio Times.
Oh, that'd be nice.
Yeah, imagine. But and then part of me thinks that if you're less than full time, that is your business, and it's nobody else's business what you do on those days off. However, the other part of me thinks I think people need to be, the more people that are open about the fact that they're less than full time and what happens on their days off kind of opens it up for other people. So I used to work with a colleague who had inflammatory bowel disease and couldn't work consecutive days, and it caused so many issues. And then she said to somebody, I don't work consecutive days because of this, and all of a sudden they kind of went, oh right. And then before you know it, everyone's a bit kinder and a bit nicer, and just that really subtle shift. So part of me thinks it's nobody else's business, but then the other part of me thinks if people speak up about the challenges that they're facing outside of work, that will have an enormous impact on their day at work.
I think you're absolutely right, because fundamentally we don't know what's going on in everyone else's lives. If you rewind the clock back 10 years ago, if I was working with a team and people really weren't bringing their game, my thought process was, well, what's wrong with you? What is wrong with you? And now, very much my thought process is somewhat different. It's, what's wrong? We do need to be more compassionate to our colleagues. We do need to recognise that when someone is having an off day, there may be an incredibly good reason why they're having an off day, and that they may need just to be left alone. They may need to be supported, but they certainly don't need to be hammered for it.
Well, no, I agree. I remember being the rota registrar as quite a junior registrar. Like I'd only been a registrar for about 6 months, and the rota registrar was seen as the worst job, so it was given to the newest person. And it was only then that I realised what everyone else was struggling with. Like, obviously I knew that I was sometimes struggling, but I had no idea what was going on in everyone else's lives. And of course, as the rota registrar in that particular job, I was the person who knew the person who had, their partner was having chemotherapy, or someone else had she had an autoimmune disease, and so she had to go to loads of hospital appointments. Someone else was having IVF and had to go and have loads of scans, and that I would then hear other colleagues saying, oh, so-and-so is so lazy, they never do such and such. And I couldn't really tell them what was going on because it was confidential what I was being told. But it really gave me an eye-opener to the fact that everybody has different challenges going on in their lives. And you're right, couldn't we all just be a bit nicer? And I just wanted to reflect on the honesty thing, which is that when I got my first consultant job, I was also advised that I shouldn't ever write on my form that I had depression. And so I didn't. And now I'm in a better position. I look back and I just wonder if my whole first consultant job would have played out differently if I had been honest from the beginning, and if I'd had the support I needed when I hit burnout. Because I don't regret now that I left. I think I did the right thing, but I do regret that I wasn't more honest, and maybe I could have left in a slightly more controlled way. Maybe I wouldn't have stayed out for so long. And I was given advice by more than one person that I should absolutely not tell anyone.
It's really sad, isn't it?
It's really sad. And I can say that now because, as you can see, things are going great now. But they weren't great. And, the advice is to not ever talk about any of those things. I know that there will be other people who will say, oh, yeah, well, I had that. And I just, went to the toilet 17 times a day. And I was fine. So why can't you? And actually, I don't believe any of those people are actually fine.
I was advised by my TPDs and my college tutors to go off sick after my 2 weeks of annual leave and special leave ran out because my wife's operation very much not planned. She was supposed to be home in 10 days. So, and at that point, there's no way I could work. I was in bits. There was absolutely no way. I was still sleeping on the hospital floor most nights. So they advised me to go and see my GP, and my GP signed me off with stress reaction to wife's illness. And that was the first time I'd ever had a fit to work note. And those fit to work notes continued, and they continued and continued until for about 6 months. And it was about 3 months in that I didn't quite know what to do anymore, and I was really struggling because I had a really good going reactive depression by that point.
Yeah.
I reached out for some help. I got some counselling, and it was brilliant. I was incredibly well supported once I reached out for help, and things steadily improved. But on this training day, when I was explaining my story and I talked about the reactive depression and coming back and how we got there, then 3 other people kind of stood up who were just members of the audience what was terrifying, this was the first time they said they'd admitted this in front of fellow doctors. One person talked about their bipolar diagnosis, one person talked about their postnatal depression. This stigma relating to mental health was just really sad, because this was genuinely the first time these people had said that in a room full of doctors. And to some extent, it was easy for me because I had a good reason. It's allowed to be depressed in my case. Whereas I was just so sad and so shocked, and I very much made sure that when I then told those stories and when they've been filmed for use in subsequent kind of seminars and things, I kept the reactive depression in. It's something I could easily airbrush out, but it's something I've deliberately kept in because I think it's so important to raise it.
It's awful that it's still happening all this time later. That, as in, the first time I was told to hide it was in 2000. And that 21 years later, some people are still not able to be honest about it.
I think it's very interesting. I think in less than full-time working as well, because I think the assumption is if you don't tell anyone the reason that you're less than full-time, people make all kinds of assumptions, and they make assumptions about you as a person and your capability and whether you're going to go off sick and all these things. And I don't think we're very, as a profession, not as a person, I don't think we're particularly welcoming of that. Oh, you're less than full-time because of mental health reasons. Like, we find it much more acceptable, and I don't agree with that it's a physical thing. So everyone can see, oh, she's not very well today. Like, that's fine.
But we also make assumptions about all sorts of other things. When I was part-time, so I could do the BMA work, I loved the BMA work. If I could have turned that into my job, like, I totally would have done it. And at one point we were going through, it was not the junior doctor strike, it was the one before that, when there was a strike over pensions. Yeah. And so one of my jobs was to go around the country telling everyone about the pensions. And so I thought I might as well give that presentation to the people in my department as well, because, I had it at my fingertips. And so one of the teaching mornings, I was like, oh, do you want me to give a BMA talk? And I'm like, yeah, okay then. So I gave this half-hour talk, which I'd given all around the country to hundreds of doctors, to the doctors in my department. I suppose there were about 20 of them. And when I finished the talk, one of them came up to me and she went, I had no idea. I said, what do you mean? She said, I had no idea. I thought you just had children and that's why you were part-time. I had no idea that you were doing all this amazing BMA stuff, and you could see her whole impression of me had changed because she'd written me off as somebody with children. And now I was someone who was doing dynamic BMA stuff. And I just thought, I was just as dynamic before. And it kind of offended me afterwards that she had decided that I was part-time because of children and that therefore I was a lesser person. My actions while I was at work were the same, regardless of what I was doing on the other days.
Interestingly, that phrase was raised at, I don't know if you were there, Phil, the National CopMed Less Than Full-Time Forum, and one of the consultants challenged it because there's a lot of evidence apparently from psychologists that by calling doctors who work part-time less than full-time, it already implies that they're not quite a full doctor. Yeah. You're already less than something else. So there's a bit of psychological evidence to suggest that even if you introduce yourself as a less than full-timer, people just hear the less, and like you say, you're part-time because you're doing other things, and what those other things are various and wonderful, and keeping your life together, but that she kind of made a motion that it should be changed to something else because of the connotations associated with it.
From my point of view, you can call me whatever you want. You can call me part-time, you can call me less than full-time, you can call me, slack. I don't really care, because when I'm going to be at work, I'm going to deliver you everything that I can deliver. And when I'm at home, I'm going to be doing other things. I'm going to be, having so much fun with my kids, and focusing on what's important to me. Yes, I agree. We shouldn't be having that kind of judgment, and we should be careful about how these labels get used. But fundamentally, I don't care what you think of the title.
I think a lot of the stuff is the compassion. We're not very compassionate towards each other. It's getting better.
Yeah.
I would say, I think I'm quite lucky that perhaps I'm in a specialty that is quite forward thinking on some of this. If I call the consultant, they'll be in. And I will, we regularly call the consultants within intensive care and anaesthetics. Any high risk case, any admission to the ICU, you call the boss. And if I begin that phone call with, I need you to come in, they always come in. There's no quibble about it. And yes, if I say I've been rung, my daughter's really ill, I've got to go home, I've got to, whatever else, you won't be thrilled. Don't get me wrong, but no one's going to begrudge it. They'll be in. And I guess I'm very lucky to be in a specialty whereby that's the case, and that has very much pushed the boundaries of less than full-time working and return to work over the last decade.
I think kind of, I think anaesthetics is a really good example of a specialty that has run with less than full-time training and shown, and when you are flexible, what you can achieve actually. And that, I personally know a lot of male anaesthetic trainees who now work less than full-time. I've got to say, in medicine, in the last couple of years, I've also seen a lot of male trainees who now are less than full-time. And I think all these examples we've had are different, people who were less than full-time for different reasons. And, the more we normalise it and it becomes, just someone works less than full-time or flexible, or whatever you want to call it, and that's just what they do. And that's, that's just because some people do and some people don't. And that's rather than having, it will be better for everybody. And I think, that's kind of, for me, I think that's kind of where we need to aim. So it isn't this big thing that is so very, very different. It's just the other side of it. I think probably to wrap up, I kind of wonder whether each of you would kind of think about what's for you, what's the one thing you would have less than full-time training be in the future, or an element of it that you'd love to change? Is there anything particularly that you would say, for me, it's this, if we could change this, I think this would make a big difference?
So from my point of view, nothing. But I've been so lucky. So what I would change is I would hope that no one else needs to be as lucky a son of a bitch as I am, because I've consistently had wonderful people around me, wonderful colleagues to support me at every stage and to make all this work. So I genuinely, I can't fault my less than full-time training experiences, both for childcare and both for family care. But I want the systems to perhaps at times be a little bit simpler, so no one else has to be quite as lucky as I am. I've been lucky. Some of the national leaders in this have been my trainers within the region, within my hospitals, which is always a useful advantage.
I would what I would change is something which I know is already happening, but I would make it a much lower hurdle to get into flexible training or part-time training or less than full-time training. I realise I don't care what it's called either. I just want people to think nicely of you. I want there to be less of a hurdle to get in.
And I would say it's probably a combination of everything that we've talked about tonight. So normalising less than full-time training, normalising and destigmatising the reasons that people are less than full-time, and enabling recruitment as such that there are enough doctors that if anyone chooses to work less than full-time with a lower hurdle, then they can do that. So not much.
Thank you very much, all three of you. We'll call it a night there. Thank you, everybody. Good night.
Thank you to everyone that made tonight's episode possible. Whenever our scholars are thinking about complex problems facing our health systems, we encourage them to think about how they make significant change in the world of healthcare. We are incredibly lucky to have some incredible scholars in the HLA. They use the HLA as a platform to take their ideas and bring them to fruition. If you are interested in the work of the HLA, why not join us at one of our future HLA events? Why not join one of our programs? Why not even become a HLA scholar? Thank you for joining us. My name is Johan Marlon, the Director of the HLA, and it's a good night from all of us.